Allow me to introduce now the speaker for today's webinar, who is Associate Professor Liam McGuire. Liam is an Associate Professor in the Department of Biology at the University of Waterloo in Canada. Liam's research program takes an organismal biology approach to investigate questions of ecology, physiology, natural history, and conservation. Liam is interested in both bats and birds, especially comparisons of these two groups of flying vertebrates. The McGuire Lab has been thinking about and studying bat migration for many years, and the talk today will get into some of those stories. So Liam's talk today is called Ecology and Ecophysiology of Bat Migration. And with that, I'll stop sharing and give the floor to Liam to take over.
That's great. Thank you very much, Chris. No, thank you very much, Chris, and thanks to everybody at Bats Without Borders for having me this morning. As I was chatting beforehand, it's exciting to be here, having seen the exciting list of speakers that you've gathered over the past series of talks. I'm excited to talk about migrating bats today. It's a subject that I've been thinking about for quite a long time. And so just to get us started, the bat we've got on our slide here, this is the star of the show for today. Most of what I'm going to talk about today is with these bats. These are the silver-haired bats that we have here in Canada. They've got a fantastic scientific name, Lasionycterus noctivagans, which translated loosely means the shaggy-haired bat that wanders the night, which by the end of the talk, I hope you'll appreciate, is actually a very appropriate name for these animals. But before we get into talking about silver-haired bats, it's especially exciting to have Chris here hosting us from Kasanka National Park, which is, of course, home to what is perhaps the most spectacular of bat migrations, the Eidolon Helvam migration, where millions of these bats come into the park every year, and you see these beautiful photos of the sky just filled with bats against the setting sun, and it's a fantastic spectacle. But I would suggest that if we were to go and ask most people about migration, what do you think of when you think about migration? I think most people would probably defer to thinking about birds. Migrating birds is a system that's been really well studied for many, 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 many years. So to get us started, I wanted to start by telling us some exciting stories about migrating birds to get us fired up, and then we'll see how that might relate and compare to our migrating bats. So first case study here. This is the blackpoll warbler. This is a small songbird we have here in North America, about a 12-gram songbird. We're actually only going to focus on a small part of their migration. These guys breed all across the boreal forest, all across northern Canada, up into Alaska. In the fall, they make their way down to the northeast part of North America here, and they perform this fantastic migration feat where they jump off over the Atlantic Ocean, and they fly 2,500 kilometers over the open ocean till they arrive in the Caribbean for their first stopover on their way to their stopover sites in South America. That flight takes, 2.5 days of nonstop, continuous flapping flight. The birds don't land, they don't eat, they don't sleep, they don't drink. They just fly nonstop for 2.5 days over the ocean to get to the first point of stop and rest on their fall migration journey. If we go up a weight class, we've got northern wheat ears. These are another fantastic example of an amazing migrating bird. They're about 25-gram songbirds, so a little bit bigger. And we can think of sort of two different breeding populations, whether we're talking about the birds that breed in Alaska or the birds that breed up in northern Canada. Either way, their migration is very impressive. The birds that breed in Alaska overwinter in Eastern Africa, so that's a one-way migration distance of about 14,500 kilometers. So a 29,000 kilometer round trip every year for these 25-gram songbirds. Or for the population that breeds up in northern Canada, they overwinter in Western Africa, and that includes a 3,500 kilometer flight over the Atlantic Ocean each way every year. So very, very impressive. But surely the undisputed champion of the bird migration world has to be the bar-tailed godwit. These are, again, up a size class. It's about a 400-gram shorebird. These guys breed in Alaska and overwinter in New Zealand and migrate from Alaska to New Zealand across the Pacific Ocean the long way. So 10, 11,000 kilometers in a single nonstop flight. like the blackpolls. No resting, no stopping, no eating, no drinking, just flap, flap, flap nonstop. I put down more than 5 days, but for some of these birds, this is 10 or 11 days of nonstop flight, day and night, until they arrive at their wintering grounds in New Zealand. So when we've got stories like these and these very obvious bird migrations and the fantastic things that they do, it's not surprising that they've received a huge amount of research attention. There's a long list of things that people have studied and learned. We know a lot about how birds migrate. And I present that as a contrast for what we think we know about migrating bats, which is really comparatively very, very little. Bat migration has been very little studied. We don't know a lot about many migratory bat systems. And in some ways, that's quite surprising because people have known about migrating bats for quite a long time. So this is a hoary bat. This is Lazurus cinereus. This is another species that we have here in Canada that migrates over long distances each year. And there's been suggestions that hoary bats and silver-haired bats and a third species, the eastern red bat, we'll see here in a little bit, that all three of these bats are likely migrants going back into the late 1800s. So here's a paper I found from C. Hart Merriam back in the 1887 titled, "Do Any Canadian Bats Migrate? Evidence in the Affirmative." And the premise of the paper is that everybody knew that bats go and hibernate in caves and things like that in the winter. So anything else would be just a wild and crazy suggestion. But Merriam goes on to present some evidence that would suggest that these bats do in fact migrate south in the winter months. And of course, we now know that is in fact the case. What has been done mostly with studying migrating bats is looking at general sort of patterns of migration and trying to categorize, figure out who migrates, who doesn't, are there different types of migration. So we might generally lump bats into sort of two groups of sort of migratory strategies. One would be our regional migrants, so something like our little brown bats, Myotis lucificus, up here in the top, where the bats come together in a central hibernation site in the winter. In this case, this is Aeolus Cave in Vermont, and then they migrate back out again in this sort of radiation pattern to their summer maternity colonies all across the landscape, and then they come back again in the fall. So not really directional, just into and out of that central hibernation site. The other category of migration, what we're focusing more on here today, is what I like to refer to as latitudinal migration, sometimes referred to as long distance. I try not to make the distance comparison because there are some of these regional migrants that can go quite a long way, and some of these latitudinal migrants that maybe don't go so far. But the key thing is this is Natusius pipistrelle, Pipistrellus natuzii in Europe, and we've got this strong latitudinal sort of north to south component of the migration in these bats. And people have taken those kind of clusterings and groupings and put them into phylogenies to sort of try and mark off sort of who migrates and what way they kind of migrate. And we've got lists of things, but we haven't really got a whole lot beyond that until fairly recently when we've had a very strong incentive to do so. Wind turbines are, of course, fantastic. Wind energy is a very important part of getting into a renewable energies. And there's a lot that we like about wind energy. But one important downside is that for reasons that we don't fully understand, wind turbines seem to kill a huge number of migrating bats every year. So this number here is now quite a ways out of date. But as of 2014, there were estimates that in North America, over 100,000 hoary bats are killed by wind turbines every year. And there's been a whole whack of wind turbines that have been built across the landscape since 2014. So there's a very, very large number of migrating bats that are killed by wind turbines every year. And largely following from that recognition of the numbers of bats that are being killed by these turbines and the fact that it's likely not sustainable, in Canada, we have the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, COSIWIC. This is the federal committee that assesses species at risk in Canada. And in 2023, they recommended that eastern red bats, hoary bats, and silver-haired bats, so these are our three most common latitudinal migrants in Canada, that all three of these species be listed as endangered because of the threat of wind energy. So what do we do? How do we approach a system where we really need to understand what's going on, and yet we know so little to get ourselves going? In many cases, the basic natural history of these species hasn't been worked out. As a simple example, we don't know where these bats go in the winter for the most part, right? We know that they're here in the summer, and in certain places we see them moving through in the spring and fall, but in the winter we don't know where they go. The bats that I'm going to talk about today, I couldn't tell you where they spend their winters. That basic level of natural history we still don't know for some of these species. So as a graduate student, I was quite interested in birds and bird migration. And so the idea arose that could we use bird migration as a model to help understand bat migration? These are both endothermic flying vertebrates. Perhaps there's some similarities in the way these animals migrate. And we could use what we know about bird migration to help learn about migrating bats. As we'll see here today, there are certain things certainly that are relevant, but I think in many ways the bat migration system is different. And I'm not going to get into it today, but we've actually got to a point where we're taking now what we've learned about migrating bats and we're turning it around to learn more about the way that birds migrate. So let's go back, way back to sort of near the beginning. And one of the first studies that I worked on with migrating bats, and this is the study where we're looking at silver-haired bats now. So these are, like I said, one of our most common latitudinal migrants that we've got here in Canada, very widespread across North America. We believe that there's some stable isotope evidence that would suggest that they are a fairly long distance latitudinal migrant. Many of these animals are moving more than 1,000 kilometers between summer and wintering areas. So, for example, if we talk about the bats in the eastern part of North America, they're breeding up in the boreal forest and they're making their way down to somewhere in the southeast, we believe, for the winter months. But of course, they can't make that all in one nonstop flight, and they're going to make that in a series of jumps, and they're going to have to stop somewhere in between. And that's where we're going to get into this now, is looking at what happens at these stopover sites. So if we look in the Great Lakes region here, we're actually going to zoom in on Lake Erie right here. It's the major lake right on the border of Canada and the United States. This is the Long Point Peninsula here. This is our long-term regular study site. So we're going to come back to Long Point several times here today. And you can easily see why this is such a fantastic place to study migrating animals. It's home to the Long Point Bird Observatory. As animals are coming north in the spring, the peninsula provides an excellent place for these animals to land as they're crossing the lake. And in the fall, this acts as a giant funnel and it gathers all these animals up in concentrated numbers so that we can catch them out here on the peninsula so we can study and learn about what's going on. So when I was a graduate student, I had the opportunity to get involved in a project that was taking advantage of a new technology. So new radio transmitters had just come out that are digitally coded. So conventional radio tracking, your transmitters are all coded on different frequencies. So to check on one transmitter and then the next transmitter and the next transmitter, you have to change the frequency on the receiver so that you're only listening for one transmitter at a time on each of their respective frequencies. What these digitally coded transmitters do is they're all on the exact same frequency, but they've got an embedded digital signature that allows us to monitor that one frequency constantly for any bats or birds or butterflies or dragonflies or whatever else it might be that's flying around with one of these transmitters. So now we can catch a bat, we can glue a small transmitter onto its back and release it. So we catch the bats right here. This is where the bird observatory is, down towards the base of the peninsula. And as long as the bat is within range of any one of these towers, so each blue balloon here is a tower with a receiver, and the red lines are the approximate direction and detection distance of the antennas on these towers. So as long as a bat is within range of any one of these towers, it'll check itself in, and we can gather information about where they are, how they're moving, what they're doing in this area. The study worked out really, really well. We did a whole lot of stuff with that. I'm going to focus just on one specific thing, though, for today, and that's the question of how long these bats are staying at the stopover site. So we catch the bats, and we always catch the bats just in the couple of hours right before sunrise. We don't catch bats in the evening. We don't catch bats in the middle of the night. You can have the nets open all night long, and it won't be until a couple of hours before sunrise that we start catching these bats. So what I believe is happening is the bats are flying over all night long, and we've got some acoustic recording evidence to suggest that that is the case. But then as they're getting closer to sunrise, then the bats come down to try and find a tree or other roost for the day. And that's when we catch the bats as they come down to the level of where our nets are at. So we catch the bats just before sunrise, we tag them, we release them, they go and find somewhere to roost for the day. And then the overwhelming majority of our bats, I've got them marked down as a 0-day stopover here because these bats then the following evening, right at sunset, off, they're gone. So they're only around just for that daytime period. They're not around for any nocturnal active periods. They're just arriving at sunrise and departing at sunset, and then they're gone. There was a smaller subset of animals that did stick around for one nighttime period. And for all but one of those animals, it was raining on that night. So it makes perfect sense that they don't want to migrate when it's raining. So they stuck around for an extra night until the weather was better. And of course, anytime you work with wild animals, they can do weird things. And so we've got these two bats out here that stuck around. They didn't actually stay that entire time. We actually just lost contact with them for quite a while, and then they reappeared again 2 or 3 weeks later. So if you keep that in mind and we see some migration tracks later on, that might give you some hints about maybe what's going on there. But we don't really know what's happening with these two animals. What's particularly interesting here, though, is at the same time that I was doing this work with the silver-haired bats, there was another group that was doing the same kind of work with black-throated blue warblers, another small songbird that we have here in North America. And these birds are migrating through on the same days, so the same weather, the same site, the same towers, the same transmitters. They're very similar body mass, so very comparable to our bats. And with these black-throated blue warblers, you see something that looks much more typical of what we'd expect of a migrating bird, where they arrive at these stopover sites and they're there for the better part of a week, sometimes even longer. So there's real contrast in the stopover behavior of these two groups, which of course leads to the question, why don't the bats stay longer? What's different here? So this got us to thinking about what's different between bats and birds, and thermoregulation became something that we thought about as a potentially very important difference. If we go into the bird migration literature, there's a good amount of both empirical and theoretical evidence that would suggest that during migration, birds actually spend 7 times longer and twice as much energy at these periods of stopover compared to the actual flying parts of migration. So if I flip that around, it means that the actual flying part of migration only accounts for about a third of the total energy expended during that migratory period. And much of that energy expenditure while these birds are at these stopover sites, they're resting, they're refueling, getting ready for that next leg of their migration journey, is driven by thermoregulatory costs. So here's some neat data from Martin Wikelski and his group working with Swainson's thrushes. And at the stopover sites, the colder the temperature is at the site, the more energy these birds are spending. The colder it is, the more they have to shiver to stay warm to keep their body temperature at their normal body temperature, which costs them more and more energy. Our temperate bats, of course, are fantastic at using torpor. They can drop their body temperature and they can drop their metabolic rate way down in these inactive periods, which would then avoid and negate much of this increased energy expenditure at these stopover sites when they're not being active, when it's cooler out and they don't have to shiver to stay warm. That would totally change the balance of that energetic equation of what's going on here. So to figure out if this is in fact what was going on, I went back to Long Point, this time with a different type of radio transmitter. These are temperature sensitive radio transmitters. So the transmitter tells me what's the skin temperature of the bat that we're tracking. In each of these plots, we've got time of day on the x-axis. We've got sunrise and sunset in these vertical bars. And the black dots are the skin temperature of the bat. Red dots are the ambient temperature. And the dashed line here is just a sort of a guideline for us to know when we would consider a bat to be at its normal body temperature and when it would be in torpor, when its body temperature is dropped down and their metabolic rate then is going to be quite low. And bats, every bat we tracked used torpor every single day. Fantastic. But they use torpor differently depending on the conditions on the day. So on the warm days, so here's a day where the mean ambient temperature was 27 degrees Celsius. This bat used a short bout of torpor here in the morning. Their body temperature was down, and then they warmed up to their normal body temperature for the rest of the day. In the middle, it's a somewhat cooler day, only about 21 degrees Celsius. We've got a bat that's in torpor in the morning, warms up to normal body temperature in the afternoon, torpor again in the evening, and then right at sunset, that bat warms up and then it departs from the site. And then on the right here, we've got one of the cooler days. The mean ambient temperature was only 18 degrees Celsius. That bat was already torpid even before the sun rose, and it's remained torpid for the entire day. But then right at sunset, the bat warmed up and then off it went, and it continued on migration that next night. Now, while I had these bats flying around and roosting wherever they wanted to and recording their body temperature as they were free living, I also got some bats that I held through the day in respirometry chambers where I was able to hold them at different temperatures. So I could measure the metabolic rate of these bats across the range of temperature that they might experience at the site. And the bats were really cooperative in that some of the bats decided that they were going to be okay and go ahead and use torpor during the day. That's these black dots down here. And some of the bats decided that they didn't want to do that and they were going to stay at their normal body temperature and their normal metabolic rate. And that's these open circles up here. So now we can predict what would be the metabolic rate of those animals, whether they use torpor with the black dots and that solid line, or if they didn't use torpor, and that's the open circles and the dashed line. So I took that information and I went back to the traces that we have from our free living bats. And I said, okay, what would be the metabolic rate if we just assume that those bats didn't ever use torpor at all, just stayed at its same normal body temperature the entire day? We can calculate how much energy they would spend. And then I can say, okay, and then what would they have spent given the observed pattern where they're torpid and then at their normal body temperature and then back in torpor again? And we can compare those two. And when you do that, we find that those bats that use torpor for very long periods on those very cold days save a huge amount of energy, right? Could be up to 90% of the energy that they would have spent had they not used torpor on those days. So very substantial energy savings for these animals using torpor at these stopover sites as they're undergoing their migration. So of course you got to have a catchy name for something like this. And so, maybe catchy is arguable here, but we decided that we were going to refer to this as torpor-assisted migration. This is the idea that bats use torpor during migration to save energy during those inactive periods. That means that any fat that they're carrying can be spared. They don't have to use it to fuel their shivering. They can use it instead to fuel their flight, which means they don't need to refuel as much. They don't have to have extended foraging periods at these stopover sites, which then potentially explains those short stopover durations that we observed. And if you expand that out to a bigger picture, it might be then that these bats have an overall reduced energy requirement of migration, which could eventually even translate into reduced mortality risk for these migrating animals. So we've got this idea, and we like the idea. I had a PhD student who came along, Jeff Clark, and Jeff was pretty keen on building on this and thought it would be really nice if we could work this into a theoretical modeling framework so that we could generate some predictions, we could generate new ideas and hypotheses that we could test in future empirical field work. And fortunately, there's already a really nice body of theoretical work done with migrating birds. This is the idea of optimal migration theory. So it's first originally proposed by Allerstam and Lindstrom. And the idea is this is an optimization type model where we look at trade-offs in three main currencies. So for birds, we think about time, energy, and predation risk as three major currencies. And if we want to simplify this, and I think for the case of our migrating bats, it's fair to do so, we can say predation risk is probably negligible. So let's focus mostly on time and energy. And if we're looking at just time and energy in a typical migrating bird, we would then think about this as a time energy trade-off, right? Migrants could either migrate faster, but it's going to cost them more energy, or they could migrate more energetically efficiently, but it's going to take longer to do that. So they've got to make decisions about whether they want to optimize for time or energy as they're migrating. So Jeff took this body of literature and he started to redevelop these models to account for the use of torpor at these stopover sites. And one of the ways that we look at this is in thinking about the way that these animals are able to refuel at these stopover sites. So energy balance is, conceptually can be very simple in terms of thinking about the difference between the amount of energy that comes in and the amount of energy that goes out. So if we've got a bird at a stopover site, during the day, these open light bars here, the bird is foraging, it's feeding, it's building up fat stores, the energy is increasing their fat mass. And then at night in these gray bars, it's cold and they're not active and they're shivering, so they're giving back some of that energy. And then they can feed some more the next day and shiver the next night and feed some more the next day and shiver the next night, which gives us this dotted line here, which is your net refueling rate, right? What's the average refueling rate across multiple days of stopover? For a homeothermic bird, for a bird that's not going to be able to use torpor, the only way for them to increase that net refueling rate, so going from that dashed line to this dotted line now, is by increasing the rate of energy intake. During the day, they have to eat more. They have to get to a higher quality stopover site. They have to change their behavior in some way so that they're bringing in more energy during the day, because at night, they're still going to be shivering and giving that energy back in the same way that they did in the original scenario here. So to get that net refueling rate up, they have to increase the rate of energy intake. For our heterotherms, for our bats that are able to use torpor, they could potentially achieve the same increased net refueling rate, not by increasing the amount of energy intake, but by reducing the rate of energy output. If they're using torpor during that inactive period, they're not spending as much energy while they're inactive. So that amount of energy they bring in during the active period, they only give back a smaller portion of that. So they can achieve these higher net refueling rates by manipulating the energy output side of the equation rather than the energy input side of the equation. So Jeff worked with that and built all these models. And one of the key outputs of these models is something that's called the flight range equation. And it looks a little intimidating, but it's actually relatively straightforward here. I'll walk you through it. Here we're looking at the stopover duration on the x-axis. So how long is an animal at a stopover site? And we're looking at the way that they're able to accumulate. In this case, we're expressing the y-axis here as flight distance, but you can also think of this as the amount of fat, right? How much energy are they bringing in and storing? How much fat do they have? And that amount of fat then translates into a certain range of flight that they could achieve fueling with that fat. So for a homeothermic animal, they're going to increase their amount of fat storage and hence their flight range relatively slowly compared to a heterothermic animal that can achieve that higher net refueling rate given comparable conditions at that stopover site. So if there's some target flight distance that the animal is trying to get to, then this model is going to suggest that the heterothermic migrant is going to hit that target well earlier than that homeothermic migrant. So the model now predicts that heterothermic migrants are going to make shorter stopovers than those homeothermic migrants. And that's exactly what we saw with our silver-haired bats compared to our black-throated blue warblers. Another prediction that comes out of these models is that under whatever scenario you want, whether we're thinking about animals that are minimizing time or minimizing energy, and in fact, I would argue that the heterothermic migrants can minimize both time and energy simultaneously. But regardless of how you think about it, under all of these circumstances, the heterothermic migrants are predicted to have smaller fat stores than the homeothermic migrants. They can get by on smaller fat stores because they're not spending as much energy day to day. So how do we test this one? This one's a little trickier to get at because we could go and look at how much fat our silver-haired bats had and how much fat the black-throated blue warblers had, but that's not particularly meaningful of comparison, right? There's lots of differences between the birds and the bats and things that are not going to be comparable. So Jeff came up with a neat idea. And we can go look at hoary bats. So again, this is another one of our long-distance latitudinal migrants. During spring migration, the female hoary bats are pregnant. And during pregnancy, they want to avoid using torpor because that has some potential negative consequences for that developing fetus. In fact, they're actually carrying twins. But the male hoary bats during spring have nothing to do. So they use torpor every single day. So this gives us a situation where we've got homeothermic females and heterothermic males. Of course, it's not perfect because there are some potential confounds of reproduction here, but at least it's the best we can do in terms of making these comparisons. So Jeff went out during spring migration, caught some hoary bats at a site that we worked at in New Mexico, and used a technique called quantitative magnetic resonance, which is this nice non-invasive body composition analysis technique. You can take the animal, you can scan it, and then let it go. And sure enough, as the model predicts, the homeothermic females do indeed have more fat than those heterothermic males. So our models are holding up. Our empirical data is consistent with what we're seeing in these models. So we're pretty happy and excited about this. So if we keep going then, and we start thinking about what else can we do with these models, one of the other implications of this torpor-assisted migration strategy might be that these animals could be very flexible in the kinds of resources they require during migration, right? Maybe they don't require. Let me back up here. During the summer breeding period, we know they have specific preferences for types of trees that they roost in that are going to be ideal for raising their young and raising their offspring. But during the fall migration, they're using torpor every single day, and they're only at these stopover sites typically for just one day. So the benefit of a perfect ideal roost may not actually be really particularly much compared to just an okay roost. So we make the prediction then that our migrating bats might be pretty flexible in the kind of roosts that they use during this fall migration period. So we're going to go back to Long Point again. And this time we're going to look at some work that my current master's student, Beatriz Nogueira Figueira, is working on. Beatriz actually defends her thesis on Monday, so that's going to be very exciting. But one of the things that Beatriz wanted to look at was where do these migrating bats go during the day? So back to Long Point, catch some bats in the fall migration as they're moving through, attach those transmitters again, and then release the bat. And now she can go out and track the bats during the day to go and find out where they went to and what kind of roosts they're using. So she did really great. We got 46 bats and found roosts for almost all of them. So we got 44 roosts from those 46 bats. And it actually worked out really nice in that most of these bats didn't go very far. All of the roosts were within 2 kilometers of our field site where we catch all these bats. Again, that's probably not so surprising because these bats are arriving at these sites just before dawn, so they really don't have a lot of time to get very far away. So now we play a game. This is the what Beatrice likes to call spot the bat. She's made it to the tree, and Beatrice is a really tenacious, and sometimes maybe she describes herself as a bit stubborn, and isn't going to be satisfied just to know that the bat is in that tree. She actually wants to get eyes on the bat specifically. So that can be a fun challenge, can take a huge amount of effort. So let's play the game together. There is a bat roosting on this tree. So what you're looking for is a black fuzzy ball, and that white transmitter with that antenna sticking out the back of it can be a good mark. So I hope I've rambled enough here. Everybody's had time. You found the bat in this photo. Excellent. Congratulations. We're off to a good start. But of course, it's not always that easy. Let's go play spot the bat in this scenario here. And in this case, I've actually narrowed it down for you. We're looking inside that gray box. I've even zoomed it in, and there's a bat in that box somewhere. If you can find it, if you can pick it out, let's just zoom in a little bit more. If you found it, were you looking right there? There's the bat tucked in there. You can just see that little white radio transmitter on the black fuzzy bat as it's tucked in there and hiding in behind that vine on that tree. Now, if you are the kind of very intense and focused field person that Beatrice is, you would even spend hours and hours and hours, if need be, to find the bat that's roosting on this tree. I'm not going to pretend that any of us are going to find the bat on this tree, but Beatrice did. It's right there. You see it still? I can zoom in even a little bit more. There's the bat there, right? You see that radio transmitter and the antenna sticking out the back of it there. So now Beatrice has not just which trees these bats went to, but where in the tree and all kinds of great information. Let's do one more. Can you spot the bat in this one? This one we've made it a little bit easier again. I can actually if this one is visible, you can see this right now. So if you're taking a look at this tree, and I'll even help you out. It's the big tree in the background, not that small tree in the foreground. On that tree, we could even narrow it down. Is the bat on the upper half or the lower half of that tree? Hopefully you're looking and you're trying to figure out where the bat is. If you said the upper half of the tree, you were right. But if you said the lower half of the tree, you were also right. In this case, Beatrice got to the tree, found a bat, but that bat didn't have a radio transmitter, and then found the bat with the transmitter. So this was actually a bonus bat. There are 2 bats on this tree, which was interesting because this was the only case where we had 2 bats on the same tree. Every other bat that we found was a single bat by itself, and pretty clearly these 2 bats are not associating with each other. So they are remaining pretty solitary during this migration. There's just 1 bat tucked into a tree somewhere. And then, of course, do all the normal things. Measure all the things about the tree, what species, what level of decay, what amount of canopy cover, what's the height of the tree, the diameter of the tree, all of these things. And we can do your basic roost versus random comparison to try and figure out what it is that these bats are selecting for. Consistent with the prediction, we didn't find much, right? It didn't matter what species the tree was. It didn't matter what the decay status was. And even a little bit surprising to me, we didn't find any major differences in the amount of canopy cover or the roost orientation. Both of those I would have expected to see something there. If these bats are using torpor every day, you would expect they might want to roost in parts of the tree where they can get some sunlight at the end of the day to help passively warm themselves back up to normal body temperature. But as you can see, there's major overlap in the amount of canopy cover in those roost trees and the random trees. And we don't see these bats clustering on the south side of the tree. They're actually distributed on all sides of the tree. So nothing much going on there. But we do find some preferences, and it looks like these bats are using sort of a 2-step process to try and figure out where they're going to roost for the day. First, on the left here, the bats preferred roost trees that have a high density of trees around them. They're like clusters of trees. So there's more trees immediately surrounding the trees the bats choose than the random trees on the landscape. And when they get into those clusters of trees, the bats are choosing larger, if not the biggest tree in that cluster. So the roost tree is a bigger diameter and taller height than the random trees surrounding that roost tree. So these bats are quickly finding a cluster of trees and within that choosing a big tree, and that's good enough for the one day that they're going to spend there. Okay, so we go back to our modeling framework again. And one of the other implications of this model is that we think these bats are going to be able to move pretty broadly across the landscape. They are able to manage their energy expenditure using torpor. They aren't going to be tied to particular high quality habitat. They can make do across a whole range of different habitat qualities. And what that might mean is that we don't see real concentrated migration routes. We don't see major hotspots where we're going to get major aggregations of these bats. They could just be kind of going all over the place. And so we want to go and look at that and see what that looks like. So in the time that I've been working on this type of work, we started off with those 5 towers, and that's now expanded into what we call the MODIS wildlife tracking system. And there are now over 2,400 towers across 34 countries. And we've really spread across a huge amount of not just the Americas, but there's some in Europe and Australia and other places as well. And good for us in that we started here in the Northeast, and this is where the densest clusters of towers are. So this is where we're going to be tracking these bats using this now expanded automated telemetry network. Those same transmitters can get picked up across any of these towers all across the whole region here. So I'm playing a little bit with timelines, but it works better for storytelling, so you'll forgive me for that. But we're going to go back now to about 2017. And there was real interest in understanding what's going on with these bats as they encounter these lakes in southern Ontario. And the interest was in putting offshore wind energy, right? There was real interest in putting turbines offshore here. And at the time, there was some thinking that, of course, that'll be just fine because we know that bats don't like to fly over open water. But that early work that I did, it sure looked like about half of the bats were taking off across the lake and the other half were going around. So we wanted to go and test that. We put up some more towers on the south shore here so that we could go and see what these bats do. Do they cross the lake or do they go around? And very conveniently, we had bats that took the time and were very courteous, and they actually read the proposal and did what they were supposed to do. Here we've got 3 examples of bats that did indeed cross the lake, right? So each one of these X's is a tower that was available to detect the bats but didn't detect. The red triangle here is the place where we catch the bats and tag them, and any of the red dots are towers that detected the bats. So here's a bat that we caught and tagged at the banding station at the bird observatory, and then it flew along the length of the peninsula and straight across the lake to the other shore. One in the middle here that went partway up the peninsula and crossed over, and so on and so forth. So we've got bats that are crossing the lake, which is excellent. And we've got bats that are turning around and going the other way. So here's an example. Got the bat at the bird observatory. It went partway up the peninsula, decided it didn't like the look of that, and turned around and went back and pinged off a bunch of towers as it's made its way across that northern shoreline of the lake. We had another sort of category of bats that they got the proposal. They didn't read it in detail. They kind of skimmed it and they got the basic idea, something, something shoreline, fine. But they got the wrong shoreline. These are bats, again, this is fall migration. These bats should be going south. And they went back along the mainland, but instead of coming around this way here across the Niagara Peninsula, these bats went up across the north shore of Lake Ontario. And this means, of course, that this is Toronto is the major urban center right here. So they're moving through major urban areas as they're making these migratory movements. And this is the real value of using this MODIS network approach. I never would have predicted or guessed that these bats would make these kinds of movements here. So we're able to really see where these animals are going. The third group, of course, are animals that just couldn't be bothered, didn't pay any attention, didn't even look at the proposal, and just did whatever the hell they wanted anyway. Again, fall migration, these animals should be going south. We catch them here, and these bats then turned around and went 300 kilometers north, and then back south, and then back up north again before eventually making their way around the peninsula. So lots of really unexpected and surprising movements that are happening in these bats. We've continued to do more of this work in the years since. So between 2015 and 2024, we've tagged bats in not all of those years, but many of those years. And I've got a PhD student right now, Lisa Horn, is working on this data, and she's aggregated a lot of it here for us. And we've got 155 bats that we've now tracked over a bunch of these years. Again, this should be southbound fall migration. Our field site is right in the center of that cluster here. And certainly there are some of these bats that are moving south, no question. But I would not have picked this out as the map I would have drawn of what fall migration might look like of animals that are moving south. There's lots of variation, lots of movement. There's some of those bats going up over that Lake Ontario shoreline and so forth, right? Lisa also then looked at just what's the departure direction as they leave our field site. There's a few that go straight south, but many of them are going east or west or north. Lots of variation of what's going on here. So lots of different things that are happening here in an unexpected kind of way, the way they move across the landscape. Lisa's also quantified this in terms of the what we call the net south displacement. So from where we caught the bats, where's the last place that we saw them? Is it actually to the south? And yes, many of these bats were getting, a couple 100 kilometers south of where we first tagged them. There's a big cluster here at 0, but this is a bit misleading. We've got a bunch of these bats where the challenge is that we are just gluing these tags off, and many of these tags just fall off. So these are bats that almost certainly the tag just fell off before they really got anywhere. So not pay too much attention to this. But there are some of these bats out here that the last time we saw them, they're actually quite a ways north, 200 kilometers north of where we got them. So lots of variation. The next step in this, and I'm not going to get into it today because this is brand new data. We're just getting this data in, but in this past fall, we've started attaching transmitters to these bats using soluble sutures, just two little quick stitches. Over time, those sutures dissolve and the tag falls off the bat. But we can now keep these transmitters attached to the bat for months, for 2 or 3 months. And this is the kind of thing that we can get. So this is students, Amanda Armstrong and Thomas Pianta are working on this. Here we've got a bat that the last time we saw the bat, it was over 800 kilometers away from where we tagged it. And if you actually follow that whole route, there's about 2,000 kilometers of movement for these bats. So we're doing this now with silver-haired bats, eastern red bats, and hoary bats. I'm just looking at the clock. I'm going to try and squeeze in one more really quick story here. I'm going to do it faster than maybe I'd like to, but I think we can probably squeeze it in. A neat thing that happened while Beatrice was out playing Spot the Bat was we got word of something interesting that happened down here on the south shore of Lake Michigan. There was a consultant out doing a bird survey on Marquette Park here, right in the south shore of Lake Michigan. And sure, counting the birds, fine. But the other thing that he saw that morning, this is the morning of September 1st, 2024, silver-haired bats just streaming over the lake. One bat, two bat, three bat, just this stream for several hours of these silver-haired bats flying west across the lake. No evidence that they were out there foraging. In fact, probably the opposite. There was peregrine falcon and gulls that were picking off some of these bats. So it suggests that there was a large number of bats migrating that night that got blown out over the lake and were trying to find their way back to shoreline. The story gets better if you go just a little further up the shoreline. You get to Park 566, where Dan is a local recreational birder, and this is his patch. He goes here all the time. And that same morning, Dan found a bunch of silver-haired bats roosting in the trees in his park. Very different from what Beatrice saw, where we're now seeing clusters of multiple bats in the trees. And Dan found lots of bats. He counted 102 silver-haired bats roosting in the trees that morning. Had never seen anything like it. And I was going to say has never seen anything like that since, except that 3 weeks later, he saw the same thing again and has never seen it since. So two different fallouts within 3 weeks of each other of huge numbers of these bats. So I think events like this just really highlight for us that we just really don't know still a lot of what's going on, basic natural history. How does weather influence these animals? How do they aggregate along common migration routes? How do they respond to these ecological barriers? What's going on in terms of the social network of these animals, the sociality of these animals this time of year? And just really emphasizes the value of basic natural history observations as an important complement to organized, planned scientific studies. So if we bring the whole thing together, we summarize it all together. The heterothermic bats using torpor-assisted migration, they can avoid the environmental costs they experience by using torpor, which means they can move more broadly and more varied across the landscape. So we're now starting to think of this almost in terms of a migratory wandering. It's really quite different from what we see in the more direct to and fro migration in many of these bird migration systems. So there's lots of really interesting and neat things for us to think about there. And I want to close just on a quote from Hugh Dingle. So Hugh Dingle quite literally wrote the book on migration and has my favorite definition of what migration is. But in contrasting bird migration to some of these other systems, Dingle refers to bird migration by saying that some of these classic examples of migration, these birds that migrate to and fro, back and forth between breeding and wintering grounds, they may actually, in fact, be extreme cases and the exception rather than the rule. And investigating migratory adaptations that seem less complete than these, like bats that are migrating across the landscape and using torpor, may prove especially revealing. And I quite agree. I'm quite excited to continue working on this system and understanding more about these animals in the years to come. So with that, I'll wrap it up and I'll close there. And just many people to thank here, all the students that have been working on all these projects over the years, collaborators, the local staff at the Bird Observatory, all the funding agencies, and to everybody that's been through my lab, past and present. A huge amount of work to summarize very quickly for everybody here. But thanks very much for everybody for coming out this morning and seeing some neat photos and hearing some neat stories about migrating bats.
Wow, thank you very much, Liam, for that fascinating presentation. And it's very good to see the amount of work that you are putting in to be able to study the migrating bats. There are a few questions that have been asked in the chat. And before I ask my question, I'll start first with what has been put in the chat. So the first question is coming from Amali. Amali is saying, bats that stayed one day, it could be the rain that you had said, she's agreeing with you, but she or he is agreeing with you, but also they say, could it be an issue of the difference in the body mass at a time of capture? Perhaps less fuel on board as the birds start the migration.
Yeah, no, an excellent question. So we do have body mass in all these bats, and we capture them, which is a good indicator of the body condition. And we've looked at this a variety of questions about the stopover and the way these animals are moving here, and from a variety of different perspectives, but no real strong indication that body condition really plays a whole lot into it. And that probably makes sense given this torpor-assisted migration idea that these bats don't need a lot of fat. So the difference between a bat in poor condition and good condition probably really isn't that much, especially when you compare it to birds. If you're working at a bird banding station, you're monitoring migrating birds. Some of these birds are really, really fat, and some of these birds are really, really skinny, and that could have a huge influence on the way that they migrate. The scale is really condensed for these migrating bats. There's not a huge difference between the heaviest bats and the skinniest bats that we see, and nothing consistent with the stopover duration that we see.
Thank you, Liam. And one thing that I'm excited to see is you also take interest to look at these stopover sites. I think a lot of people do study where the animal is coming from up to where it's going without really looking at the stopover sites. There is a question that is coming from Rachel. She's saying, how close do the bats with the digital recorded transmitters need to be to the receiver to be picked up?
It's a tricky question. It's a good question. It's a tricky question. There's a little bit of magic involved. There's a lot of factors that can really vary the detection range. So if you think about more conventional radio tracking, the animal has the transmitter and you're holding the antenna and you can move the antenna around to point to where the signal is strongest. With the automated telemetry, the antennas are fixed in place. And so as the animal moves around, sometimes you're going to be right in the nice beam of that antenna. Sometimes you're not. Sometimes there's a tree in the way or a hill in the way or other things. Sometimes the bat is facing the antenna. Sometimes it's turned away from the antenna. So what I will say is we have examples of bats that we've detected simultaneously on two different towers that were 28 kilometers apart. So there is a potential to detect some of these bats up to 14 kilometers away from one of these towers. I think that's exceptional. There is a finite point in space where if the bat is oriented in just the right way and the weather is just right, you can get well over 10 kilometers of range. I think more typically we're probably in the maybe 1 kilometer sort of range. But the number of animals that we tag that then we just subsequently don't pick up on or only get a few detections on suggests to me that there's lots of ways that these bats can move across the landscape and avoid the towers. There's a lot of blind spots, even with that high density of the tower network out there.
Thank you, Liam. So in your presentation, you did mention that in the summer, as they migrate to the summer roost, the hoary bats, you did indicate that the males are hectotherms and then the females are homotherms. So there's a question from Carol. She's saying, do the male hoary bats arrive sooner than the females at the summer roost?
So yes, the males are using torpor during spring migration because they've really got nothing going on. So I should back up here. The system here is like many temperate bats. The mating season is in the fall migration. So similar to hibernating bats that have a swarming period where the males and females mate prior to hibernation, we've got a similar thing with these migrating bats where the fall migration is the mating period, which opens up all kinds of interesting questions about would some of these more wandering movements maybe have some kind of a social basis in terms of maybe males and females trying to find each other on that landscape. These are all largely solitary species. They don't form huge maternity colonies or anything like that. So there could be something interesting going on in the fall with that. What that means, though, is that in the spring, the males have nothing to do. They've already mated with all the females. The females store the sperm over the winter and then ovulate in the spring. So what we actually see is the opposite. The females are the ones that make their way all the way up to their northern breeding sites where they're going to give birth and raise those pups. The males really have no incentive to make that migration. There's no reason for them to go all the way. They do eventually make their way north. We have very, very little data. I'm actually working on trying to get a project together to do more detailed spring migration tracking now. But the idea might be that the males just kind of take their time and eventually make their way north to intercept the females as they start coming back south again during that fall migration mating period. But this is all total speculation. We really don't know what's happening in that spring migration, why these bats are making these movements, what's happening with those mating systems. Is it the male bats that make it north that have the best chances of successfully reproducing, or are there some of these male bats that stay in the south and can wait for the females to arrive? We really don't know.
Thank you very much. I think there's a comment from Steph talking about how fascinating some of the discoveries you have made, how the flying birds come down to roost early morning, and also how they change from being habitat specialists to habitat generalists during the bird migration. So there is another comment from a question from Amali. The figure showing the migratory direction looks more like a regional migration than a latitudinal one, but the idea is that they are still ultimately going south. Do you want to comment on that one?
Yes, exactly. So I believe, Emily, this is probably the figure that you're thinking about here, and this map over here. This is it does in many ways look like it would be something equivalent to that regional migrant where they're all moving away from the point that we've tagged them all, which of course is exactly what happened. The important thing here is when we are attaching these tags, they're not harnessed, they're not attached other than just with glue. And that glue really only holds, for most of these bats, about a week. It's a very short window that we get into their fall migration with the gluing the transmitters on. So yes, we see many of these bats look like they're going north, but ultimately the interpretation and some of the data that we're getting now from this most recent season where we're actually getting the longer term tracking is that yes, these animals are eventually making their way south. Lots of interesting questions about why and what are the drivers of that. Is it in some ways the facultative where they kind of move part way south and they wait for the weather to push them the rest of the way south? Are there social implications for how they do this? What's the mating season have to do with why and when they eventually make their way south? Lots to figure out still, but yes, the idea here is that some of these bats go immediately south, others do other things in between, but our impression is that ultimately these bats all do make their way to the south. There are a small handful that overwinter in the Great Lakes region, but the bulk of the population goes farther south to overwinter.
Thank you very much, Liam. I think there's a lot of response from the audience, and I think I'll just squeeze in two more questions. There is one question from Lombe. So Lombe is asking, are the silver-haired birds fully or partially migratory?
I would love to give you a good, clear answer on that. We don't really know. I would say that in the east of North America, at least, we believe that they are more fully migratory, that most of the population is migrating. There's probably some differential migration in there where certainly the females probably migrate farther than the males, and there are some bats that do overwinter near the Great Lakes and others that probably go farther south in the winter. But as you get out west, it might be a little different. There might be different migratory populations. There's been some suggestion that the silver-haired bats up in the Pacific Northwest, sort of Seattle, Vancouver, around that kind of area there, they might be year-round resident in that area, non-migratory, but very, very little information about that. So differential migrants for sure. Partial migrants, strong possibility, but can't say definitively one way or the other.
And lastly, I think on the account of time, I think there's a question from Mark. So Mark is saying the stopover roosts, how do they correspond to normal night or day roosts?
So I guess it depends on what you consider normal roosts. If you look at where they go during the summer in their breeding colonies, these bats are very much preferring decayed trees, snags, loose bark, crevices. They're getting tucked in and tucked away, avoiding the elements. Great microclimate for their developing pups. But during fall migration, as you saw in some of those photos, the bats just plunked right on the side of the tree, not even trying to get tucked away. So other than the fact that they're choosing some of these bigger trees, which are probably just going to be more stable, they're not choosing for particular microclimates. They're not choosing for particular places to hide. They are just kind of finding anywhere is good enough for the day, shut down, and then carry on the next night.
Thank you very much, Liam, for your time and for an excellent presentation. I think there's been a lot of congratulatory messages in the chat just to appreciate the work that you're doing together with your team, all those that are involved. I think at this point we'll bring the discussion to a close, but if there are any who would want to get in touch with Liam, you can look up the McGuire Lab and then you can be able to get in touch, or you can get in touch with us at Bats Without Borders. Then we can get you in touch with Liam so that you can get to know more about the work that they are doing. We also appreciate all of you who made time to be able to join and be able to listen to this excellent presentation from Professor Liam McGuire. From us from Bats Without Borders, we want to say thank you, and we'll see you again next month, the fourth Wednesday of next month. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Chris, and thanks everybody. And absolutely, please email me if you have any other questions. I'm happy to chat and carry on the conversation.
Thank you, dear.